For some people, this proposition may seem far-fetched, but ending poverty is both morally necessary and actually feasible. All of us must play a role in making it happen. All human beings want, and have a right to live in dignity, to determine our own destinies, and to be respected by other people. Despite the universality of these rights, our capacities to fulfill them vary enormously, and no dividing line is more profound in influencing the quality of our lives than the gulf between poverty and prosperity. Well, there's a positive obligation on the bank to ensure that the people who are signing a loan guarantee know what they're doing. Loan guarantees are kind of unique in that someone is giving security or a guarantee and placing themselves at risk for someone else, and they receive nothing material in return. So you've got to ask yourself, why is this person doing this? Do they know what they're doing? They're risking a lot, and not really getting anything back for it. So the imperative is that the bank must ensure that these people know what they're doing, and that they fully understand the implications of what they're doing, and they know that their properties may be sold if another person doesn't meet their obligations. Oh, it's very spooky. First of all, probability by itself is spooky. Let me show you how probability enters the system. You walk past a store window and you see an image of yourself in the store window. You straighten the part, not so bad for a man of my age. The guy in the store window who's fooling around with mannequins, he sees you and you see yourself. What does that mean? A stream of photons from sunlight leaves your face, heads for the store window. Let's consider one of them. It has a choice: it can go right through, so that the guy behind the window can see you, or it can be reflected from the store window. Some fractions of them are reflected, and some of them go through. What determines that? What determines the future of that photon? And countless such examples teach us that it's random, that it's a throw of the dice, and that's where Einstein made his famous statement, God plays dice with the universe. That every instant of that single object, that quantum object, we have probability, we do not have certainty. No, and that's an important aspect. As you alluded to earlier, we've previously done work which has proven that in some situations, even people whose blood pressure is not high, can benefit from blood pressure lowering therapy. So in this study, the main reason that we included the patients was because of diabetes. We didn't care what their blood pressure was, whether it was high or low. And our objective was to see whether or not lowering average or below average blood pressure in diabetics was beneficial, and the result suggested that irrespective of whether your blood pressure was high or low, if you had diabetes you benefited. What's an article? I was asking myself this very question in the post office yesterday, standing in line waiting to sign for, as it so happens, an article. A postal article. Not the postal article. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, an article in English is a word that precedes a noun, and simply indicates specificity. This sounds quite complicated, and to be honest, it's quite complicated to say without spraying everyone within 15 feet, but the concept's quite simple. The definite article in English is the word, the, and indicates a specific thing or type. For example, the train is an hour late. By contrast, the indefinite article in English is any of the words, a, an, or, some, and the indefinite article indicates a non-specific thing. For example, would you please pass me an apple? We always precede a word with, a, if it doesn't start with a vowel sound. For example, take a hike. "I'm spending a weekend at Bernie's," or "There's a knight in shining armor." Similarly, we precede words with the indefinite article, an, if they do start with a vowel sound, for example, an ostrich, an enormous mess, or an occupational health and safety policy. Although the original American Indian cultures were highly diverse, they were similar in many of their traditions. Religious beliefs and rituals permeated every aspect of Indian life. Southwest tribes such as the Hopi and the Apaches had a rich and elaborate year-round sequence of ceremonies including songs, dances, and poetry. The Hopi performed dances to bring rain. The Apaches engaged in special dances and ceremonies to gain support of the spirits before undertaking raids or going into war. The Plains tribes often sought contact with the spirits by going on a vision quest. Archery, the practice or art of shooting with a bow and arrow, has played an important part in English history, being the main weapon of the foot soldier and instrumental in winning many battles in wars with the French, with whom we seem to be constantly at war during the Middle Ages. The English favored the longbow over the short bow and the crossbow, the latter being the main firearm of militaries on the European continent. The crossbow fired a metal bolt released by a trigger, rather like a gun, and had the longest range of any of the bows, but the main advantage of the longbow was its accuracy. The importance placed on archery is illustrated by the fact that medieval kings in England encouraged the practice, and one of them, Edward III, went so far as to ban all sports on Sundays and holidays except archery. Because there were no standing armies in those days, and in the event of war rulers had to call on the populace, everything was done to make sure there were large numbers of competent, if not expert archers, to recruit. When societies were still mostly rural and agricultural, waste disposal was hardly an issue, partly because people tended to make use of everything and partly because there was plenty of space to bury rubbish. It was when societies became predominantly urban and industrial that problems arose, mainly to do with health. City authorities had a hard time trying to find efficient ways of getting rid of all the rubbish. One of these was to get people to sort out their rubbish into different types, just as these days we are encouraged to separate our rubbish into different categories for easier removal and recycling. So, for example, kitchen rubbish was set aside and used for feeding animals. However, fears of disease put an end to that. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that all waste was simply thrown together and plowed into landfills. Leisure travel was, in a sense, a British invention. This was mainly due to economic and social factors. Britain was the first country to become fully industrialized, and industrial society offered growing numbers of people time for leisure. This, coupled with improvements in transport, especially the railways, meant that large numbers of people could get to holiday resorts in a very short time. Modern mass tourism of a sort we can easily recognize today began in 1841 when Thomas Cook organized the first package tour, in which everything was included in the cost: travel, hotel and entertainment. To cater for the large numbers of new holiday makers, holiday camps were established, both on the coast and in the countryside, and they became immensely popular. Their popularity declined, however, with the rise of cheap overseas tours, which gave many people their first opportunity to travel abroad. No news is good news may be true for most of us most of the time. After all, we don't look forward to unpleasant things happening to us, but bad news is good news is true for those who work in the news media, and, I suspect, for the rest of us, at least some of the time. It is tied up with stories and our seemingly insatiable need for stories. Have you ever been gripped by a story where nothing goes wrong for the characters? There's an incident in a Kingsley Amis novel that nicely illustrates this. The main character Jake comes home to find his wife chatting to a friend about a hairdresser both women know who has moved with his family to somewhere in Africa. Jake listens in, expecting tales of cannibalism and such like, but no, the friend has just received a letter saying they love the place and are settling in nicely. Jake leaves the room in disgust. We demand to be entertained, and while we don't object to a happy ending, the characters have to have experienced loss, pain and hardship in one form or another along the way to have deserved it. Classified advertisements placed by individuals in newspapers and magazines are not covered by the Advertising Standards Authority's Code of Practice. If you happen to buy goods that have been wrongly described in such an advertisement, and have lost money as a result, the only thing you can do is bring a case against the person who placed the advertisement for misrepresentation or for breach of contract. In this case, you would use the small claims procedure, which is a relatively cheap way to sue for the recovery of a debt. If you want to pursue a claim, you should take into account whether the person you are suing will be able to pay damages, should any be awarded. Dishonest traders are aware of this and often pose as private sellers to exploit the legal loopholes that exist, that is, they may claim they are not in a position to pay damages. In the 19th century, few people could afford to travel abroad, it was expensive and there weren't the mass transport systems that we have today. So curiosity about foreign lands had to be satisfied through books and drawings. With the advent of photography, a whole new dimension of reality became available. Publishers were not slow to realize that here was a large new market of people hungry for travel photography, and they soon had photographers out shooting the best-known European cities, as well as more exotic places further away. People bought the pictures by the millions, and magic lantern shows were presented in schools and lecture halls. Most popular of all, however, was the stereoscopic picture, which presented three-dimensional views and was considered a marvel of Victorian technology. Stem cells are the body's master cells, the raw material from which we are built. Unlike normal body cells, they can reproduce an indefinite number of times and, when manipulated in the right way, can turn themselves into any type of cell in the body. The most versatile stem cells are those found in the embryo at just a few days old. This ball of a few dozen stem cells eventually goes on to form everything that makes up a person. In 1998, James Thompson announced that he had isolated human embryonic stem cells in the laboratory. At last, these powerful cells were within the grasp of scientists to experiment with, understand, and develop into fixes for the things that go wrong. When the European Economic Community was established in 1957, its aim was, in broad terms, to move towards closer political and economic cooperation. Today, the much larger European Union has a far-reaching influence on many aspects of our lives, from the conditions we work under, to the safety standards we must adhere to, and the environment in which we live. In order to achieve the free flow of goods and services, workers and capital between the member countries, they needed to establish mutual policies in areas as diverse as agriculture, transport, and working conditions. When they had agreed on these policies, they became law. Now, though, the EU is concerned with a far wider range of issues.